You are on the next level. This is The Beautiful Truth, where the expression is still free.
20 seconds and counting. 10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
And you're very welcome. This is The Beautiful Truth with Fintan Dunne reporting. Thanks for joining me. A little while ago, I did an interview with Thomas P. Sheridan. He's the author of Puzzling People, The Labyrinth of the Psychopath. And we took a fascinating trek through the personal, social and political aspects of psychopaths and the psychopathy which is ruling our planet. And I did say I wanted to get back and do another interview with Thomas. I had to take a few weeks off though. No, not a vacation, just a battle with a summer influenza, my first in quite some time, but that's out of the way. The immune system has won, maybe the same kind of way that we're going to win the battle against the psychopaths with the help of the likes of Thomas Sheridan, who's joining us on the line right now. Thomas, you're very welcome once again to breakfornews.com.
Thank you very much, Fintan. Thanks for having me back. I'm glad to be here.
We got some great response from members of the forum to the last discussion we did, where we covered both the personal and political aspects of psychopaths. You struck a chord with people, especially in terms of people who can remember now, looking back, hey, I've been dealing with psychopaths. It does seem to open up people's awareness of the phenomenon when they lay it out as you have in the book, Thomas.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I find that quite often. It's almost like a repressed memory, a repressed psychological memory of sorts is unleashed when people confront this information and the underlying, behavior within the pathology and how it impacted on people. And this does seem to be a common thing that, like, people can suddenly remember an individual going maybe right back to their early childhood who quite possibly may have been a psychopath. It's a very interesting dynamic in itself how this happens. It really is almost like a repressed memory being unleashed when you're exposed to this information. Yeah.
Well, we had one person on the forum, Howji, who commented, I am truly haunted by these psychopathic experiences. I attract these people like flies to SHYT, which is an awesome prospect for Howji. But do you find that happens also?
It does happen now and again. Thankfully, it's not that common. I was talking to one fellow in England recently, and he's telling me he has the same problem. He seems to be a magnet for these things, and I have covered this in the book to a certain extent. It's got a lot to do with finally coming to terms with what's happening, and also learning how to develop a sort of an almost defense system around your own psyche in order to stop these individuals from targeting you again, because they do have an ability to, it's an sort of like predatory wisdom they have, where they can quite quickly suss out a person who would make an easy target. And that doesn't mean that the individuals are weak. Very often it's the other way around. It's generally, they will target strong-willed and, you know, promising and people with good potential. But the person who's getting constantly targeted, they have to come to terms with there's something within their personality. Mm-hmm. Perhaps they're not guarding their psyche enough. Perhaps they're too open about themselves and approaching others. Perhaps they're dealing with an unresolved issue regarding abuse in their past, maybe from a parent or something they went through in childhood. But they really have to start looking at this and developing a sort of a strategy in order to deal with it. And when they finally resolve this, they will stop attracting these people. Unfortunately, it usually takes one psychopath too many to get most of us to sort of finally wake up right. and realize that there's something, you know, within us that needs a little bit of work that has constantly attracted this experience into our lives.
Yeah.
Yes, it's not unusual.
And indeed, one of the problems we have is that the psychopaths are not going to fit any crude stereotype. Jimbo comments in the forum also about a private school which he is at, where they're letting in students which he finds charming, funny, and yet totally disrespectful of the rules. Bad students, effectively, rowdy, violent. They do the eye scanning thing. This is rapid eye scanning movements to suss people out as they're surveying a social scene. They do appeal to my ego, especially because I find their antics kind of cute, but now I see them in a different light. So, psychopaths can be, according to Jimbo, they're charming and funny people.
Oh, that's how they nearly all are in the initial contact stage. You will get someone who's just, will play on your ego, and they will be extremely charming, and they will have all the flattery and all the lines and pat down, and they can seem very witty, and at times they can seem like when you first encounter them, the most intelligent people you've ever met. But it's really just a whole lot of window dressing. What you're getting is a stage show. It's no more real than the cardboard cutouts and painted scenery on a theatre stage set. Behind that is just a stone wall. And when you prod and dig behind that facade, what you get is once you get behind that, you get behind it very, very quickly, and you will see what these people are. But they will have, as long as they're targeting you, they'll have a vested interest on keeping you believing that the stage set is indeed reality.
And just another comment from the forum, that's Eve Carson, who's a member of the forum, says exactly what I've encountered in my life on a very dangerous level, and I'm confronting it. And she's referring there to her own battle for justice in the case of Joan Webster, who was a daughter in a CIA family where both mother and father were in the CIA. Eve is working to try and get the truth of Joan's disappearance and murder. But of course she's dealing there with sort of what is almost, I suppose, institutionalized psychopathy in the CIA.
Yes, you'll get this. This is very common in families where you have the family may have a high level of political power and political protection. It's also common in families that have long Freemasonic traditions as well, where there'll be a sort of an immunity towards prosecution, and the family secrets can be very, very dark indeed, and very, very deeply held, and almost impossible to uncover. In some cases you're dealing with a psychopathic individual, but quite often you're dealing with people who bought into a psychopathic culture or a mindset, and they become part of it, and to the point where they become a form of proto-psychopath, where they're emulating all the behaviors of a natural psychopath, but doing it according to the ethos of the organization or the body politic which they're attached to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, in that case, doing it according to deception manuals produced by the CIA, explaining how to deceive.
I'm assuming this may have something to do with the MK Ultra thing. This has been a huge problem, not just with CIA families, but any kind of family involved in espionage and any kind of government research involving military. There's endless stories of family members being used in research programs, and it's not unusual, particularly in the United States. And it's one of the great unspoken tragedies of the modern time. It is a Holocaust in many ways. There are large numbers of people who are growing up in comfortable middle-class homes all over, particularly the United States, but in other Western societies as well, who've actually been violated, and having their civil rights violated through a psychopathic individual or through courtesy of a psychopathic entity or organization. And they're the unknown and they're the forgotten thousands and perhaps millions who carry these appalling secrets of what was done to them inside them. It's very similar to what we had in Ireland with the clerical abuse up until that blue opened in the 1980s. Mm-hmm.
I've seen recently a documentary describing the amazing experiments that were done to people, not just by the Nazi scientists, but by some of those Nazi scientists when they came to the United States and continued the same kind of stuff, but even by medical professionals who, for example, in the Tuskegee case, left syphilis in black men untreated to see what would happen.
Yes, and they would also pump people with large doses of LSD, including actual family members to monitor them. The airmen case, the Tuskegee airmen case, where they infected them with syphilis, I believe there was even other things that went on. In a French village, which the name escapes me now, in the 1950s, they put LSD in the local bread supply to the CIA did this in order to try and pass it off as ergot poisoning, and this has led to a sort of a psychological destruction of this community in France that was only recently declassified lately. I also believe many other strange anomalies, such as these Mothman flaps that happened in Point Pleasant in West Virginia in the 1960s. This had all the hallmarks. When you look beyond the sort of superficial paranormal way these things are presented, that this had all the hallmarks of an MK Ultra LSD mind control program put on top of a community. Yeah, and I believe there's a lot more things out there that have yet to come to light.
Yeah. Well, we're talking there about an attitude set, say among the medical professionals who participated, and these were research universities across the upper echelon of the United States university system. The elite universities participating in experiments on people which clearly violated their civil rights. So there's an attitude set that goes with that, of not really seeing them as complete people. And it occurred to me, it's similar to what you mentioned about the two-dimensional personality of the psychopath, that they also see the rest of the world as cardboard cutouts, not real people, just 2D flat figures in their landscape.
Well, I think a lot of it comes through their medical training and stuff like that. If you're working on cadavers, it becomes very, in your medical school training, the long hours that they put them through, this causes a form of dissociative identity within their behavior as well. The easiest way to mind control somebody is to keep them awake all the time. Then you're dealing with things like vivisection in research laboratories. If you're going to cut open a chimpanzee, it's really not much of a step onto a human being. So there's a sort of an element of dehumanization takes place within these individuals, that they're mind controlled, they have almost robotic approach to what they're doing, and ultimately it's about money. Money talks at the end of the day. They want to keep their jobs, they want to keep their paycheck, and they want to keep these research grants going in. And the individuals and corporations, whether they be the CIA, the Rockefeller Foundation, DARPA, or KGB, or anyone else, MI5, they know that the money is the ultimate thing here. If you take away a person's economic security, especially if they've invested a lot in terms of their education and so on, that's the best way to control them. Yeah.
Well, speaking of control issues, Urban Spaceman in a response on the forum mentioned the issue of a single powerful Illuminati, and that concept versus something that you mentioned in our last discussion, Thomas, and that's that psychopaths are, in many cases, certainly not in all, but in many cases, just that little bit not there, not having that edge that's needed, and playing pretense a lot of the time.
Well, before I answer that, I have studied very deeply into the whole thing of the Illuminati and stuff like that, and I am quite well aware of the real history there. And it's a far more complex history than, you'd have where, among the conspiracy theory people, where they would shout Illuminati at any kind of overriding control system. I won't go deeply into that now, but that's something that that people need to work on further. That the Illuminati and the whole concept of the Illuminati and the possibility and the reality of these kinds of, lineages that control these overlords, or these overlord sort of like systems through the ages. It's a very complex thing, and sometimes the bad guys have been the good guys and the good guys have been the bad guys, and it all got mixed up basically around the time of the Enlightenment. But outside the actual, outside talking about it in an Illuminati, and if it does exist today or not, I personally don't believe there is an Illuminati, not today anyway. This creates these individuals, even if you look at their early history, when they're really like the Bavarian Illuminati and Adam Weishaupt, when they had like the initial tried to infiltrate Freemasonry, it was done very haphazardly, and it caused a rift within Freemasonry in around the late 1700s. Basically damaged Freemasonry, which up until that point was not a pernicious organization. It was basically just a form of. It was basically a sort of a spiritual men's club that came out of the fragments of the Knights Templar, who had it in for royalty. And the reason the Bavarian Illuminati was created was to sort of speed the difference, the transition between monarchies and the fake republicanism that they had planned, which is basically again a business strategy, because as naval technology and seafaring was developing, they had to develop new political systems to tie in with this, and that's where things like the Dutch East India Company came in, and the whole thing of the Dutch Republic. And these things were ultimately very, very specifically, minuscule detailed to the 9th degree plans to control and manipulate. But they always, like all psychopathic-driven pathologies, there is an inherent element of self-destruction in it. The Opium War with China really destroyed British trade in Asia and put it back for probably about 200 years. Where if they hadn't have indulged in this, or a couple of hundred years, if they hadn't indulged in things like the Opium Wars, if they hadn't indulged in things like going to war against Russia in the Crimea, they probably would have boosted British trade and protected the empire longer. If they hadn't have put in all these fifth columnists to create an ulster in the Middle East during the Balfour Declaration, they probably would have held on to the oil fields in the Middle East. So it's interesting, as much as they plan and these sort of like these imperialist corporate agendas, as much as they seem to plan them to the nth degree, like all psychopaths, just like on the individual level, they go one step too far and they throw their entire plan into chaos. It's almost like the same thing that psychopath has. Psychopaths constantly lie, and they'll often lie when telling the truth is actually the best option for them. It's the same kind of thing.
Just reminding me of something in the area of politics, which maybe we'll get to in just a moment, truth and lies. But there is a terrible danger, and we've seen that mature, that just as the individual psychopath is engaging in perhaps partly unconscious mind control techniques, instinctive mind control techniques, collective groups of psychopaths in institutions like the CIA have experimented with mind control. I mean, they're talking about institutionalizing that as an institutional strategy, an arm to be used against the people. And they've done enormous research into that. So we can assume that psychopathic control techniques are being used on us collectively right now.
Oh, and it always has been. This is a very ancient science, going right back to Greece and, particularly the time of Plato. This is why the ancient Greece and Rome was filled with theatres and amphitheatres and arenas. This was to condition the population through entertainment to align themselves with a particular military or imperialistic agenda. There's some phenomenal information regarding Francis Bacon and John Dee's relationship within the Tudor court. In Elizabethan England, they were actually lobbying the Tudors to show them how they could mind control people by changing the English language, and that's how where English language was trained, has been changed today. Even certain words and terms they use will actually, they're almost like as a form of mind control. For instance, like here's one, the word conscience. When you have a conscience, if you break that up, you have con and science. You have against science. So to actually have any kind of empathy or remorse or sort of compassion for others, you're against science. And little phrasings like that, little words like that, these all begun with Francis Bacon and John Dee in the Elizabethan court. And this is a science that's been going on for a long time. We're constantly mind controlled, not in an obvious way. I don't think there is such a thing between absolute and relative mind control. I think all mind control is absolute, but it's the actual method in which it's imposed. It's either obvious, direct, or it's abstractive, or it's subliminal, but it's always the same effect. It will always get into the subconscious and change the person in very, very specific ways, whether we use like sort of specific archetypes, ways of speaking, ways of addressing, ways of using language, then straightforward to things like propaganda. This is a very ancient science, and it was taken to its limit when Edward Bernays, when he went to the United States in World War I to basically mind control the American population and to support Woodrow Wilson going into war against the Germans. And when he was finished that, he created the whole science of public relations. And, he's probably, if you were to name somebody of the 20th century that truly changed the world, it's probably Edward Bernays, and yet so few people have heard of him.
Yeah, indeed, and the techniques and tactics which he developed have become the corporate lexicon, the methodology.
Came from family. He was Sigmund Freud's nephew or something. So he knew all about psychology and playing on people's insecurities and egos. Yeah.
Well, we see it. This has also been raised in the forum now in response to our interview. And ATM posted a video of Barack Obama where he says the classic Joker smile, where the mouth is smiling but the eyes aren't. Even more interesting is recent media coverage of a guy called Ken Morris who worked for Sarah Palin, who describes getting sucked into Sarah Palin's world and regretting and indeed having to apologise to people for some of the dirty stuff he did on her behalf.
Well, Sarah Palin absolutely is a classic female psychopath. I spotted that right away as soon as she came on the scene. You can tell that, I mean, I'm not going to go into her personal life, but I'm sure she's had a lot of fun getting her way to the top. She will use anything she wants. You know, she was an attractive woman growing up, and she's still quite attractive. I can see the high testosterone levels, the predatory sexual nature of her is very obvious, just superficial smile. There's a sort of a plasticness about her that's very frightening. There's an underlying passive aggressiveness. I saw a video of her today, and she didn't even know who Paul Revere was. And as she realized that she was, like, you know, screwing up the story of the Paul Revere legend, you could actually see the psychopathic malice come over her. This sort of hatred where the eyes open up, the pupils dilate, and there's almost like clenched teeth, like what they're really saying is, get the hell away from me. But they'll say it with a smile, with that sort of sprayed-on smile. Sarah Palin is a terrifying individual to me. I wouldn't even ask her the time of day. If there's one person in the world I could actually put a poster girl for a female psychopath, it's absolutely her. Barack Obama's an interesting one. I don't think he's a psychopath. He's just an actor, a puppet. He's just a showman that's been wheeled out by the agenda to have a nice smile, play the game, and he's loving every minute of it. I think he's more of a narcissist who doesn't really care. Once he gets his paycheck and is put in the limelight, he does have that smile, but that could also be from training. I would not be surprised if he's had some kind of theatrical training. Well, I'd nearly bet he has, and those kinds of smiles are used within showbiz and Hollywood. I did an interview on another show recently, a few weeks back, and the host of that show was a former Hollywood actress, and she was telling me all about how they're trained to smile in that way as well. So I think that's what's going on with him. I wouldn't say he's a psychopath. I'd just say he's just a puppet show businessman, an actor, an X-Factor politician. That's the way I'd describe him.
Deborah King, who wrote on this back in 2008 about Sarah Palin, would probably agree with you about Palin, because an article entitled "Sarah Palin is a classic psychopath as defined by Lowen Psychodynamics" came out in 2008 from Deborah King, and she speaks about this black and white mentality that psychopaths like Palin have. It's a sort of kill or be killed.
Yeah, and it's purely, as you says, black and white. It's almost like a moral binary code. What can serve me and what can't, and any kind of morality attached to the option or the choice doesn't matter. It's like the computer HAL in the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. It just purely implements what's needed to get business done. And that film is actually a very good analogy of a psychopath, but in a technical sense, in terms of the computer.
Great areas I'd love to get into with you on this, but let's just follow that political and social issue up for a while, and that's to do with Obama, for example. We know the techniques he was using include neuro-linguistic programming techniques built into the speeches that he was giving, which gave them that extraordinary power. I saw that they had been allegedly written by some 21-year-old college kid, right, a bright spark, but I don't really buy that. They seem like theatrical constructions, as you were mentioning there.
Yeah, well, they come from the actual theatrical background in terms of things like method acting, the pregnant pause, the anticipation, the silence. Hitler used this quite a lot. If you look at some of his old addresses to his rallies, there's a theatrical aspect to the use of language. And again, it's what we come back to the mind control thing. You can put a phrase like saying "yes, we can" over and over again. If you say that enough times, it becomes a phrase that embeds itself in a person's subconscious. It doesn't have to be anything like "yes, we can" or "keep hope alive" or any other buzzword, 1,000 points of light. You could just say something like, bread, butter, and cheese, over and over again, and the majority of people will actually start to say it, repeat that as a mantra. It's just like a tape loop of just verbiage is put into the actual subject's mind, into the target's mind, and it's words that have no underlying meaning. I found that very profoundly here in Ireland during the Lisbon Treaty. The yes posters were specifically designed in such a way that the word yes which you associate with positiveness. Yes, which you associate with maybe, the having a sexual orgasm like Molly Bloom at the end of Ulysses, opposed to no, which is negative, which, and you could see how the posters were done. The yes posters had this, the word yes was almost like in the typography and the graphic design they used, they almost looked like show business or something. People voted for that without any real depth to the message, just like people voted for Barack Obama without any real putting any kind of emotional or psychological or intellectual capital upon his mantras.
Yeah, well, that's something that you're starting to take a look at, Thomas, on Thomas Sheridan Arts. That's your YouTube channel. Is this issue of cultural and corporate symbols that are all around us, and because they are symbols, they're controlling us in unspoken ways? Yes, well, this is initially how I became kind of woken up in a way. I am a visual artist, and I do have, my background is in corporate graphic design as well as being a painter, and I've also been interested in things to do with symbolism and archetypal motifs and visual cues and how they're used to change a person's emotional state. I worked at Citibank, Citicorp in New York, and I can remember in the design department getting the corporate standards manual for graphic design, and it was absolutely specific in how it showed how the Citicorp logo should be used, placed, its distance from text, what colours could be used and what colours couldn't be used. And I just thought at first that this was just all because they had corporate copyright law, and like all trademarks and logos, there was a specific usage sort of charter to go with them. But later on I found that wasn't the case. The Citicorp logo had been designed in such a way that made it look like there's certain archetypal shapes that appear in the human mind if you put an electrical signal into our brain and close our eyes. They appear as certain shapes. There are often things like a circle inside a dot inside a circle, or a cross, and a very common one is the Celtic cross motif. The Celtic cross shape is really what the Citibank logo is, but it's stylized into an oval, and it was originally designed from this. It was the original logo of the bank was a windmill, and it was a stylized windmill, but it was designed in such a way that the designers knew that this shape had a specific emotional resonance on people who view it. This is also a very ancient science. You can actually trace many of the logos that are used in corporations today, in public bodies and in regalia and even flags, right back to the earliest cave art 25,000 years ago. These are archetypal symbols embedded within the human consciousness, and I can tell you for a fact that these fellas, these big boys in charge of all these companies and organizations and even political groups, they're very well aware of this, and they use this symbolism to control us. This is one of the reasons why people in modern cities are constantly tired. They're bombarded by symbolisms and logos all around them, mainly corporate logos, and it's literally burning their breath. They're burnt out at the end of the day from seeing all these things, even though they don't immediately recognize them. Well, yeah, they're all over the landscape. If you're not watching TV, where you're going to get drowned in them, they're all over the landscape as well. But you're saying the shapes and down to the colour as well?
Oh, yeah. Specific uses of colour is very important. Like the colour red is very common during the 20th century. The colour red is very interesting. The spectrum analysis of the colours is about 690 nanometers, which is a low vibrational colour rate. It actually makes you feel repressed, and this is why the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century and earlier, such as communism, the British Empire, they used the colour red. It's also why the red carpet was used to denote the elite. A red carpet would be laid below their feet. Subconsciously, when we were exposed to this low-frequency colour of red, you would have a feeling of being lessened. And here are the elite walking on top of a red carpet, makes them automatically seem regal and have an extra stature above us. And the red, this is why they've used it. Red is also a colour of conquest and things like rape and sexual aggression. So, even colours are used that way.
Well, that's a very powerful insight there, to realise the extent to which this stuff is unconsciously having an impact on us.
Oh, yeah. Well, you look at a star, the 5-pointed star. Now, look at what that's used on. It's used on everything from communism to U.S. military vehicles. It's used on the Heineken beer company. These things are very powerful. This is a very ancient science going right back to the mystery schools in Egypt, and even probably earlier to Babylonia. And these people know exactly what they're doing, and this is something that we have to protect our consciousness. This is also one of the reasons that psychopaths target us, is because we're visually and symbolically clueless. We're never taught on this thing in school, unless somehow, like me, you turn out, you're an artist, or you turn out to be, you study graphic design and you become aware of all this stuff. Mm-hmm. But yes, this is something it's causing us enormous problems. This is why I'm a great proponent that we have to develop our own new symbology. As we're to get out of this mess, we have to start developing our own archetypal symbologies. Symbolism, and to change our own consciousness, because the corporate logos of today, we have to transcend that and the regalia of the past and develop a new visual motif going forward. It really is a battle of consciousness. When all is said and done, this awakening, this truth movement, this political and global awakening, it comes down to a battle of consciousness. First, we have to protect our consciousness, and then we have to develop a new form of consciousness to move forward.
Yeah. Neil says in the forum that's definitely a sense of awakening collective consciousness coming through in your work. And it brings me back to something you mentioned there about the royal figures on the red carpet, going right to the heart of looking for the links between the interaction between the abused individual and the psychopath at an individual level, and also the same thing happening at a social level. To an extent, if we say, look at Yahweh, the Hebrew God of the Old Testament, and that God is a jealous God. That God will strike you dead for, anything.
Yeah, no, he's a psychopath, the God of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Do what I do. He loves you conditionally. He loves you one minute, hates you the next. He'll just, and that's a lot of it comes down from that as well. That's why when, Constantine, who is the Roman emperor, who, allegedly, but didn't actually convert to Christianity. Mm-hmm. He was very aware of this idea, and that's what the real purpose of the Council of Nicaea was. It was to create a new religion that would steadfasten the rule of kingdoms and leaders, emperors and tsars and Caesars on earth, by somehow associating them with the god head in the sky. This is where the Pope and stuff came from, as God's representative on earth. And not only that, all the English monarchs and all the other monarchs as well.
Yeah. Well, we know, for example, in the relationship between a psychotherapist and the person who's been treated, that there is a phenomenon called transference, where there can be attachment to the psychotherapist on behalf of the person who's been analysed. So similarly, we have a similar dynamic between the abused person and the abuser. So is it essentially a fear dynamic that drives us to create these figures up on the pedestals and then go and worship them?
What happens is, we develop, if you look at the actual person who's a proto-psychopath, I'm talking about someone in a relationship. You would talk about someone like Moira Hindley, who was one half of the Moors murderers with Ian Brady and killed those children in Manchester and tortured them back in the 1960s. There's a very interesting dynamic to the proto-psychopathic condition. It's a sadomasochistic thing where they worship and adore the authority figures above them and despise anyone they see as they deem as being below them. And this is why you have a situation in the past where people were less educated and more easily mind-controlled, mainly through things like diet and also through military training, where they would literally charge into like a cannon or a machine gun for a king who, basically didn't consider them human, but they didn't care. But the king to them, or the queen that they were dying for, would seem almost like would be a god figure on earth. It's a form of it's a very interesting dynamic, but it's a sadomasochistic drive ultimately, I think.
Yeah, and people can get trapped into this stuff at the social level and not really realize what's going on.
Yeah, and also I was reading about, I get on these weird tangents, but I was reading about military cannons, bronze cannons that were used in military, and in most cannons built in the last 200 years, before the development of modern artillery, in the cannon at the top would be the royal insignia of the royal family who you were fighting on behalf of. And this was to impose this notion. It was sort of like a psychophalic projection of the king's prowess, almost like a sexual phallus in the form of a cannon. That was as you were firing that cannon into the enemy and killing them, it was almost like it was almost like an extension of the king's own sort of power.
Yes.
And that's why many of these cannons were stylized and actually made to look like phalluses, even with the foreskin, on them and everything. These were not designed functions to strengthen the cannon or to, change the projectile qualities of the cannon. This was purely a sort of a phallic implement. And one of the things they used to do is when the battles were won, the enemy cannons, which would have the insignia of the other side, would be melted down and put into sculptures. If you go to the Wellington Monument in the Phoenix Park in Dublin, the actual thing is a gigantic Masonic edifice, and he was a big-time Freemason. But it's also a penis. It's Wellington's penis, and around the outside there are bronze friezes that are made from captured cannons at Waterloo and various the battles in the Peninsular Wars and all the other campaigns that Wellington took in, French, Russian, and Spanish cannons, and they're melted down and made into these friezes and put onto the side of the monument. It's almost like when the enemy has been defeated, the king's sexual prowess, of the enemy's sexual prowess, has then been taken away. And that ties in very, very strongly with the whole notion of psychopaths and sex and power and sex. It all ties in. And so, when there's a sexual neuroses to much of this as well. And this is another aspect to why they built towers and, so on. A lot of it comes from that. Okay,
that's very illuminating, and we could follow that up a lot. But one of the things that's great about your focus and your work is that we have a growing awareness of psychopaths at the individual and social level. And that's through that awareness that we can then become cognizant of what's going on, educate ourselves, and begin to look at a new landscape, one devoid of the symbols, as you say, that it's going to matter where we look. But in that dynamic that takes place, and you described it very well in Puzzling People, there's a degree of self-entrapment taking place between the target and the psychopath that's targeting that person. There's a self-entrapment. And perhaps there's also a similar self-entrapment taking place in our relationship with our leaders and our institutional structures.
Oh, absolutely. Now you're talking about the self-entrapment from the aspect of the victim.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. But there's also an interesting kind of self-entrapment in the aspect of the psychopath as well. They tend to, once they have the enablers and the minions, they won't have an opt-out plan. This is often what brings them down. There's no fallback plan, and when things go wrong, they're completely screwed. But the entrapment thing is because the victim in a personal relationship or in the society has completely externalized their whole consciousness over to the psychopath, and they're no longer really themselves. What they are is sort of like a puppet, and their consciousness has now been sort of invaded like a parasite through the persona that the actual psychopath has used to work them, where they no longer think of themselves as being able to function or think for themselves or even live without the psychopathic, giving them, the go-ahead to do and think about anything. A classic example of this would maybe a woman who's married to a psychopathic man, and perniciously over the years he will break down her psychological sovereignty, that even if he's a complete jerk who slaps her around and treats her appallingly, he'll have broken her down to the point where even if her life is miserable and she's a complete mind-controlled slave and a complete enabler and serf of this individual, she'll actually still think he's a fantastic man, and will actually go in public. When she's in public with him, she'll actually tell other people what a wonderful man he is or a wonderful woman. Another thing that happens too, and this is a very common one, a person in a relationship with a psychopath, the psychopath will often finish the sentence of the person who's talking. So if I was with a psychopath and I was talking to you and I began a sentence, the psychopath in public will often interject and finish my sentence for me, even if the sentence is not even when they complete the sentence with something which I was not going to state at a point I wasn't make. And this has trained me over time to know that eventually the psychopath will become my representative in public, so I don't have an opinion anymore. Mm-hmm. And you see that all the time with things like with government agencies and all this. These experts who tell us that we have to have lithium in our drinking water. They complete our thoughts for us. They don't actually give us a choice of what we should think. There's no debate. There's just the white coat expert comes on television and says you have to do this, that, and the other. And this is the whole thing that's happened. We've been trained not to think for ourselves anymore and rely on experts to do our thinking for us, and that's incredibly psychopathic.
Yeah. When I was thinking about our last interview, an image came to me of an individual walking towards the light will cast a shadow. The shadow that dogs us as we move towards the light is a psychopathic shadow, is what we're discussing here. If you were of the shadow and if you're looking away from the light is truth and light is reality. Essentially, these people then are in the illusion business, either at a personal or a social level.
Yes, well, light can be used in two ways. It can be used to illuminate or to interrogate. If I'm interrogating you, I will be standing behind the light, shining the light in your face, and all you'll see is the light, but you won't see me behind the light. You'll only hear my voice. Mm-hmm. And that's how they use the light against us. This is all, we're getting into other fields now, sort of occult and the sorcery and this other kind of weird religious aspects the elite have. But the other way with light could be used can be to illuminate the darkness around us to see it. And that's our job. Our job is to take control of the light and shine it on injustice, to shine it on psychopathology in society, and to take the light off them. At the moment, what's happening is that they're interrogating us with the light and they're standing behind the bulb, and we're seeing nothing, and we're just being dictated to and confused. This is also why a policeman shines a light in your face when he pulls you over at night. It's to distort and confuse you. It's a very interesting dynamic. It works on both a sort of a physiological level in terms of the actual effects of the photons on your psychology, but it also works on a metaphorical level exactly the same way. Light is this is why light has always been a very sort of powerful motif among the controlling classes, right back to the beginning of time.
Well, that you've taken that issue in a direction I didn't expect. And it's so true what you're saying about the light that shines on you and the voice behind. You could nearly do a whole hour on that alone. But that issue of illusion, if we look at, say, the use of corporate advertising and corporate PR systems, we see them essentially selling illusions to people. So do you think that is their field?
Yeah, and they're selling a false impression of yourself. They're taking your psyche and they're removing it and replacing it with a manufactured one that's not who you really are. See, this is another thing as well. We all have to start sitting down, and this is what gives us the ultimate advantage over the psychopaths, whether the psychopaths in the job, psychopaths in our lives, or the psychopaths in government, is that we're capable of doing something that they can't do. We're capable of self-examining, self-referral, self-realization, and then working upon that. Psychopaths don't have a shadow side, a shadow self. I'm talking now in the Jungian sense, where they reflect upon their shortcomings and their idiosyncratic behaviors, and then project them upon others. They don't do that. They just don't think there's anything wrong with them. But they don't self-refer of themselves. They don't sit down and think. Now, our problem is we tend to overanalyze a lot of things. But we really have to, as individuals, sit down and start self-referring ourselves, our behaviors, and then this will give us the ultimate advantage over them, because they're not capable of deep, insightful self-referring. They're not capable of that, and this is what ultimately gives us this is what gave me the advantage over them, because I basically had sat down and I started taking notes, and I've got mountains of notebooks of all the past individuals, relationships and situations I was in that were definitely psychopathic, and this allowed me to create a common thread that ultimately manifested in puzzling people. And I think we've all got to do the same thing, because I've actually transcended it now to the point where I can actually safely say, I've still got a lot of work to do on myself, but my consciousness is probably as open as it's ever been in my life, and we're all capable of this. And the first stage towards that is self-examination and then acting upon that.
Well, that's the value of your assault on the issue of what's going on with psychopathology from every possible aspect. You've researched it at every level and then challenged it at every level.
And I'll tell you one thing as well. I absolutely love my life now because some people say that ignorance is bliss, and maybe it is if you go about it the wrong way. But I honestly would never go back to the way I used to be. I actually find the world and my life far more interesting now because my eyes are open and I see with almost like a new vision. And I can walk down a street in any city in the world and become aware of how certain things are changing my consciousness. And it's tremendously interesting and it's tremendously liberating. And once you're awake and you're open, you never want to go back. It's just such a good way to live. You're truly living a good life, probably for the first time in your life, because you're finally free of all the toxic and pernicious, tsunamis of information and deception and distortion that you've been bombarded with since childhood.
Yeah, well, there are a great deal of people who are switching on to a different level of understanding, and a lot of it's happening on the internet. People who are switched on are streaking ahead of the rest of the population at a phenomenal rate, the ones who are on the internet. Because
that's why the ones who have not woken up, or the ones who have an agenda to stop it happening, they've tried to make out in the early days that people who are becoming aware are what they call truthers in the United States, that they're somehow sad potheads who live alone and have no friends and they're socially isolated, and they invent these conspiracy theories because they've no power. Well, I can tell you for a fact that people I know who have woken up are the most empowered people I've ever met in my life. They're absolutely, very happy and content. Now, they may have went through an early stage of sort of like fear and paranoia, and that's totally understandable. But once they get over that, they will have a very rich and interesting life that many people are missing out on.
Yeah, well, I think I've seen that, and we've seen it on the forum on breakfornews.com, where people have gone through the fear and paranoia element as they get to grips with a new way of looking at what's going on around them, educated by stuff like 9/11 and other issues. There is an uncertainty at first, but a growing confidence among those who stick the course and begin to discriminate between the bullshit that's on the internet and the stuff that is of value. And
it's just like the woman who escapes from a psychopathic relationship with a man. She goes through this, the doubt, the pain, the paranoia, the fear. But then you will actually, or a man too for that aspect, or even a child from a psychopathic parent, and then you just see the flourishing of that person's consciousness. It's exactly the same.
I wonder how this ties into the sort of spiritual aspects, and I know that you've also discussed in your YouTube videos the mystery of consciousness. There is something going on with psychopaths. There's certainly something going on that becoming aware of them and their action is part of this transcendence that we're going through right now.
Right. Well, nothing in nature exists, does not exist for a reason. They're here for a reason, okay? They're not a tiny random mutation. We're not talking about 1 in every 1 million people. We're talking about 4% of the population. So nature has brought these mutations, or wherever they are, into our reality for an absolute reason. And I believe completely that the reason for this is to somehow trigger the next stage of our evolutionary development as a species. And they've always been here, sure, but now there seems to be almost like the zeitgeist seems to be that everyone is switching on to this reality, that's this sort of demon that's lived amongst us. And this I really do believe that this is how human evolution, both, and when I use evolution, I'm talking about all kinds of evolution: psychological, spiritual, biological, social, political, economic. I'm using evolution in the fullest sense. I'm not talking about just Darwinian evolution, but it's evolution with capital letters, all from beginning to end. And this is why I believe they ultimately exist. This is the soul, as I said in the book, the soul evolution trigger on a personal level. I have met nobody who's gone through this experience and recovered who's still a hardcore atheist. Now, I'm not saying they become religious holy rollers. I mean, I came into this stuff very unwillingly myself. I was Mr., reductionist materialist science. I didn't believe there was anything outside of us other than oblivion. And I can tell you, I'm quite surprised at the person I am now. And I think a lot of that had to do with my own, this journey I took through my own awakening via the labyrinth of the psychopath. But I think it's happening to a lot of us. The path that I took.
Yeah, well, certainly there's, there is a rationale and a rationality to the use of a scientific viewpoint, and it's good up to a point. But of course, so much of what is fed to us as scientific truth has been twisted already, so that, you do have to wrestle yourself free of it, and I've been as entrapped by it. I now look at or listen to Richard Dawkins and I sort of shake my head and say, there, but for the grace of God and some serious life.
And who would want to live that way now? I find that just as absurd as fundamentalist Christians or any other, religion, in the same sort of trap. We have to remember, too, there's actually a lockdown happening here. Dawkins was put out there for a reason. This radical atheism didn't happen by accident. I think science is going through a collective nervous breakdown. I'm talking about materialistic science or reductionist science. We'll say that like modern science probably began with Kepler's first law of motion back in the 1500s, where they started to quantify and measure everything. And this went on until the turn of the last century when quantum physics came along. And this this shook it all up. Well, I think since then, materialistic science and reductionist science has tried very hard to hold on to, what they had gained up until that point. And we see it now to the point where, if you look at things like the so-called science behind man-made global warming, and you look into things like fluoridization of water and stuff, public municipal drinking water, you can actually see that a lot of scientists, if they're not outright whores, who are you'll say anything or come to any conclusion for the money, I'm more likely to suspect that there's almost like a collective nervous breakdown going on among the scientific community. What's happening is you have the vested interest, the tenured professors who have a lockdown, and this is why you have the witch hunts against scientists who, approach things differently. And I know this has always existed to a certain extent, and it is probably healthy in some ways, but it seems to have gotten really bad in recent years. I mean, if you look at some of the emails that were leaked from the Climate Gate thing, some of these scientists, I'm not going to say they were psychopathic, but they came pretty damn close with some of their comments about wanting to actually kill scientists who disagreed with their findings and stuff like that. So I think we're at a very wonderful time. It's a great time to be alive. And one of the things we're going to see now is a new form of science come about that will probably be a lot closer to what Newton was when before he moved from alchemy into chemistry. And I think you're going to see a sort of a more holistic form of science move forward. If, and this is a very important if, we don't let these maniacs in charge derail the whole thing.
I think there's a process underway. You can see it in the increasing disregard for political and social structures, the increasing education of the masses, who now, for the first time ever, understand the monetary basis for a lot of their distress that they're in. When was the time you could interest the voting public in monetary policy before now? And yet there they are now. That's at the heart of the political issues that people are dealing with. So, yeah, at every level, everyone is dealing with these issues and starting to come to terms with looking at things in new ways.
Well, the one that gave me hope was the 2009 swine flu pandemic. I mean, the way that was hyped up, it was just astounding. The vast amounts of money, public money, that was spent on these vaccinations for a flu that really was no worse than the regular flu, and how the whole public did not buy into the hype. And that, I think, was a significant turning point. And I think that rattled the hell out of them. The more people were like, whatever. And that really frightened them because they were so used to a docile, compliant public up until that point, doing exactly as what they were told. And I think in years to come, the sort of public rejection of the hype and hysteria, I mean, it was full on at the time. The journalists were literally, in hysterics, writing articles about how, this pandemic was going to all kill us if we didn't get the vaccine. And ultimately, the vaccine was nothing more than a bailout, a public bailout for the big pharma companies. And the public rejected that. I mean, the city of Berlin destroyed 3 million vaccines that were unused, and that population of Berlin is 3.25 million. So that shows you how much that flopped, and I think that rattled the hell out of them.
There's too many people who are outside of the television system, who are on the internet, and who are capable of finding out information for themselves and discussing it among themselves, and that goes right up to the top of science. I found your comments about science and the reformation that we're going to see in science very interesting as well, because this is fundamentally what we're talking about here, Thomas. We're talking about is understanding scientifically what is going on at a social and personal level between us and psychopaths. Why? So that we can become smarter and see what's happening, see the truth of what's going on, and then therefore act against it.
Absolutely, and when we can deal with that problem, then we can move on to, when we get that out of the way and process this issue and deal with it. And I'm not talking about things like, oppressing psychopaths or anything. I'm just saying more or less just ignoring them, non-compliance. Then we can start moving on to building a better future for all and a better personal life. And we must live by example as well. I mean, that's the real. Up until this point, I was basically a guy who hid at home, didn't even come out about many of my opinions. But I felt so empowered and so liberated by becoming this person I am now, that I wanted to share this experience with as many people as I could, because it's, you look at people, you go into people's houses and you see them in front of the TV with their microwave dinner in front of them, and their eyes glazed over, and there's something wrong there. They're not all there. Their soul has been switched off or damaged, and we've got to get these people back. If you live a good life and you seem to be happy and positive, it almost rubs off on other people. You become attractive to other people. They want to talk to you. They want to know why. Hey, why is that girl down the road smiling? Why is she always happy all the time? It's because she's woken up and she now has a new way of living. She doesn't watch TV. She goes into the countryside and studies nature, and maybe is taking up things like pottery or bread baking, and she seems quite different. And this is how we have to, we have to make, this whole thing of, Alex Jones walking down the street with a megaphone shouting in it. I'm not targeting him out, but those kind of fear-based truthers or whatever, we have to shun them and keep away from them, and try to bring people along with a smile on their face and live by example.
Yeah, you've pointed out something. It was in one of your videos on the YouTube channel, Thomas Sheridan Arts, about zeitgeist and about this whole issue of getting involved in some kind of a group that's going to do some kind of political this or political that to change the system. Dangerous kind of territory to get into, you felt.
Yeah, well, I'm very much against the zeitgeist movement. Now, I'm not against the people who are going into it or are attracted to it. I think a lot of them are well-meaning young people who are just about waking up, and they're suddenly, what they're doing again is externalizing their consciousness to an exterior control force. When I look at the zeitgeist movement, I see some pretty good ideas in it, but I also see things like, the UN's Agenda 21 and how the cities are laid out, and I don't like the idea of being dependent upon the machine community. That's certainly not the solution we need. That's certainly not how we should be developed. One thing, we need less centralization, and the zeitgeist movement is about more centralization. I also have specific concerns about this notion that they're going to make a common heritage. Well, it's not going to happen, but their idea of making a common heritage of the world's resources. Okay, then who runs the resources? Are we going to create a zeitgeist version of the World Bank that's dealing with resources rather than money? And who gets to say who owns the resources? Suppose I don't want to give away my resources. I think for my community, whatever, there's a zinc mine nearby, I could do better by, it would be better in our community for us to have it. Is it going to be taken by force the way, the cops are taking, Ireland's gas and oil supplies up at the Corrib Basin away? So we don't need more control. We don't need more centralization. We need more people breaking away and forming more organic solutions based on personal empowerment and not on, grand visions or anything like that. We've tried that over and over again in many different guises in the past, and it's failed us miserably. And one more try is not going to make it better.
Yeah, it's almost like the small is beautiful idea. Because the larger the group, the more amenable and likely it is to succumb to psychopathic influence at its upper tier. Because these people, cardboard cutout as they may be in their emotions, they often make damn good organisers and runners of big institutional structures. So there you go.
Yeah, the Soviet Union was a classic example of that. You know, the NKPV and then later the KGB, but also even things like in China, the Red Guard and Maoist China and the Chinese Cultural Revolution. They were terrifying examples of that kind of psychopathic efficiency in terms of a totalitarian, mindset. Again, this is not the way to go. The way to go is small, beautiful, and to restore the individuals.
Yeah, that's very much your perspective, is to take it at the individual level and let it be a death from a billion cuts as a billion sensate people on the planet start to tune out of what's going on at the moment. It's happening. It is happening indeed.
And it's got them frightened, it's got them rattled.
Yeah, well, there is a significant segment, I can't recall, Thomas, where I came across the information, of individuals in the United States, maybe 40, 50, 60 million, who really are ready for this big time. They're not going to need to be...
Even in places you're hearing now about large groups of young Israelis who are refusing to join the military, and that's kept quite well out of the media, but that's a big sort of sea change within their culture.
Yes.
I was talking the colour red. One of my hobbies, going back to when I was a kid, is astronomy, and I've always been interested in astronomy. And I have a prism, and I used to have a spectrometer, and the actual redshift of the sun has changed. The sun is now more blue than it used to be, and I've noticed this as an artist as well. And the sun has absolutely been changing big time in terms of its light quality in the last year or so. This is all tying in with all that stuff as well. So it's really phenomenal what's going on. I often wonder if our consciousness is actually making this happen. Which is why the Hollywood had this distinct to sort of make 2012 look like the end of the world,
A disaster movie, yeah.
So it would happen, or we would get negative about it,
Yeah. Well, I think they're always trying to suck the energy out of what they know is coming anyway, and anticipate it. But in terms of the mind understanding, they certainly intuitively figured out what was going to happen on the planet and this transcendence that we're going through right now.
And the way Terence McKenna showed that it's also almost perfectly synced with the Hindu Yuga cycles, the Hopi calendar, and the I Ching has a calendar system that actually counts down to 2012 as well. I mean, it's truly phenomenal.
Yeah, well, I've had the same experience, Thomas, of looking forward every day to making new discoveries with a liberated consciousness post-indoctrination, and it's great fun. I mean, one of my favourite ones about illusion and reality and the world around us is to simply look at the duality of night sky and day sky. We have the sun in the day with a blue sky background, and then at night we have the moon with the stars as a background. But wow, funnily enough, the moon and sun are the exact same size as observed in the sky, even being 400 times bigger the sun than the moon. It just so happens they are in position. Now, science tells us that that's just an accident, and that we're just an accident, but that doesn't look accidental.
And our moon is much too big for our planet. All the other our moon is gigantic relative to the other planets.
Yeah.
And there's other things too as well. The tidal locking, which causes the same side of the moon to face towards us. It's locked too perfectly.
It is.
It's spot on. And the way it affects women's mental cycles and growing cycles, it's just, I know there's some incredibly wild theories out there about it, but again, if you're coming from the realm of consciousness, I guess anything is possible.
Well, it would match, wouldn't it, if the structure we're looking at, the world we're looking at, has been designed by consciousness itself. I would regard it as a design by the latent power of the God consciousness that's coming into being.
Well, Fintan, I can tell you for a fact that I've painted things that a year later or 6 months later actually happened.
Right.
I painted places. My wife would tell you this. I painted individuals out of my consciousness. 6 months later, the actual event happened.
Right.
And so it's like artists like Jung did say, they do have this almost ability just to see the zeitgeist before it happens. But I also think it's also an element that artists and creative people in general, and I'm not talking about just painters, but poets and musicians, they're creating the culture going forward too as well. like Terence McKenna said, if the artist can't find a way, the way cannot be found. It is, it's a war of attrition with 1,000 battles, but they're battles of peace. They're peaceful battles of non-compliance. That's the important thing.
Terrific. Folks, if you'd like to get more on how psychopaths are working, perhaps in your own life or in the society around you, go to Amazon and check out Puzzling People, The Labyrinth of the Psychopath, or Thomas Sheridan Art's YouTube channel. You have a website also, Thomas?
It's labyrinthpsycho@blogspot.com.
labyrinthpsycho.blogspot.com. Okay. The work of education of individuals and educating us all about the often hidden psychopathic landscape that we're working in is what Thomas Sheridan does, and he does it so well. And thanks again, Thomas, for joining us.
And thanks for having me on again, Fintan, and thanks to your listeners too.
Okay. Wow. An amazing amount of stuff. We've done no more, I think, than tap into a small amount of Thomas's encyclopedic knowledge of the subject. And it occurs to me, actually, thinking about it, that it's not just a question of us defeating psychopaths, but also defeating psychopathic thinking. How do we know what psychopathic thinking is? Well, it's the kind of thinking which devalues or even fails to consider at all. Well, it's the kind of thinking which fails to consider the human being, whether that's in a corporate or a local community or a grand political or even a grand political institution. And that kind of thinking and the battle against that kind of thinking is clearly one in which the entire planet is engaged right now. It's a battle, I think, we're winning. All right. That's it for this edition of The Beautiful Truth. I will be back again very soon with more, and I hope you can join me for that. But in the meantime, forbreakfornews.com. This has been Fintan Dunne reporting.
Will you always keep me warm? Hold me safe and away from harm. Keep day from night, and as the day fades, burn a candle right for me. Will you always keep me warm? Hold me safe and away from harm. Keep day from night, and as the day fades, burn a candle right for me.